Welcome in, everybody. This is your self-care staffing for Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. I am Lou Pascal. I'm the school social worker in the Manchester City Schools in Manchester, Tennessee. And we're continuing our series this week talking about reading as self-care. And today I want to talk about reading problems and give you some encouragement to perhaps address those reading issues. So, some examples of reading problems. As we ended our video yesterday, we talked a little bit about I'm not a reader. So I will say to you this. If you feel like you've never been a big reader, I would suggest for your consideration, maybe you have never found the correct format or the correct genre that works for you. So format. Maybe you need to try Kindle books. Maybe you need to try audiobooks. Genre could be so many things. You could be more interested in comic books or zines. You could be more interested in like a short format type situation, which we're going to talk about later this week. You might be interested in certain topics that you've never tried that authors choose for their books. So I would just say, please don't give up hope. There may be something out there for you. You just haven't found it yet. Another thing is I would encourage you to not be book shamed. Okay? You like what you like. There is no shame if you are an adult who likes children's books. I know of many that feel that way. I would encourage you not to be shamed about what is a real book. I've seen people talk about audiobooks are not real books. Kindle books are not real books. They're all real books as far as I'm concerned. And you can decide that for yourself. Is an audiobook a real book? Is a Kindle book a real book? That's up to you. Another reading problem is when we're grieving. We might not be able to read as much or at all, or we might read a lot more. Okay? So I've experienced changes to my reading life a couple of times. When my husband and I were doing caregiving for elderly relatives and I had a lot of anxiety about it, I needed something light, and I definitely wanted a story that ended in a happy way. So I think there was a series called Home to Harmony by Philip Gulley, and I devoured them. I read every single one of them just because it was light and mostly happy. And that's what I needed at that time. I definitely remember reading a lot less around the time that my grandmother died. You may not be able to focus as much if you are experiencing grief, and that may apply to you right now with what we're experiencing with COVID-19. There can definitely be a grief aspect to that. Another reading issue is knowing that you may have reading triggers. So reading triggers would be something like reading something that causes you some unpleasant feelings. So I'll give you a couple of examples. My grandmother was a little girl during the Holocaust, and she never read about it. In all of her 80 years, she tried not to read books about the Holocaust. She just knew that was more than she could bear. If you are a parent, you probably want to screen books carefully and be sure that you don't end up reading something that involves something bad and scary happening to a child. You don't want to read that and then be laying awake in the middle of the night because you've been terrified by what you're reading. And here's some reading dilemmas. To reread or not. I'm not a rereader, generally speaking. From time to time I'll reread something, but mostly I read it one time and I'm done with it. My husband is a big rereader. He rereads the Lord of the Rings books every year. That's just part of his reading life. Another dilemma is to quit books or not. If you're not enjoying the book, do you quit or do you persevere? I am not a book quitter. I'm not being condescending about that or snooty about that. I don't intend to be that way about it. I just have this thing about I feel like I need to continue if I've started a book. And I'm going to share a video with you today that goes along with that. So I do not quit books, but I know a lot of people who do, and I don't know that there's a wrong or right answer to that. So a couple of book dilemmas there for you. So here is your self-care check-in question for today. What is a reading problem you're currently experiencing, and what might help you to address it? So give some thought to that. Here are some quotes, and these are quotes kind of about the grief idea that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I have several. The first one is, you know that experience of reading thoughts you haven't yet articulated to yourself? That's the quote. She sort of asked the question. You know that experience of reading thoughts you haven't yet articulated to yourself? And then another quote from the same book. She says, too mired in my own sorrows to get interested in anyone else's, for the first time I was unable to read. Every book I opened, no matter how comedic or superficial, came back to me and my failure. And that was Pamela Paul, and she wrote My Life with Bob. Flawed heroine keeps book of books, plot ensues. Bob is her book of books, and that's how she tracks her reading. And we're going to talk about tracking reading later in some other videos too. Pamela Paul works on the staff of the New York Times Book Review. And again, her book is all about how she tracks her reading. So here's the last quote for today. She sat in a parlor surrounded by books, reading fairly desperately for pertinent, helpful passages that might make sense of her broken life. And that is Charles Frazier from his novel Verena. And so you have, in those quotes, you have both sort of ends of the spectrum. You have a person who has had a hard time continuing to read because she's grieving, but also reads because she's looking for those statements that articulate what she kind of hasn't been able to come to terms with herself yet. And then you have the other extreme, the other end of the spectrum, which is a big increase in reading during a grieving time, just kind of trying to make sense of things. So the book that I'm going to leave with you today is, again, a children's book, and it's called The Book Hog by Greg Pizzoli. It's a really nice children's book about reading. And then the video that I'm going to link for you today is How Bill Gates Reads Books. And he's going to talk in there about how he has a hard time quitting books too. So I will link that for you. And if all hearts and minds are clear, again, I appreciate you all being with me and dedicating time to watch these videos. And I will be back tomorrow to talk some more about reading as self-care.